Eleanor hadn't been on a date in 3 years. Not since her last heartbreak shattered every ounce of trust she'd built after years of therapy. Journal pages and slow conversations with herself in the mirror, and yet, somehow, here she was, back. In her favorite cardigan, heels she wasn't sure matched the weather. And a heart that wouldn't stop beating too fast. Standing outside, Calf Delilah, waiting for a man she'd never met, but who came highly recommended by her best friend, Monica, who promised, no swore Hugh, was different. Eleanor wasn't sure what different meant anymore, because she'd had different before, different manipulators, different heartbreakers, different men who all said the same lines with different smiles, but as the bells above the cafe door jingled softly and she stepped inside. The warm scent of cinnamon, coffee beans, and old books wrapped around her like a blanket she hadn't realized she missed. She chose a corner table near the back, where the shelves held worn-out novels and forgotten poetry, and tried to calm the tremble in her fingers as she stirred sugar into her tea, glancing at the door each time it opened until, finally, just 5 minutes past their agreed time, a tall man with a short beard, plain navy t-shirt, faded jeans, and 2 bouncing 5-year-old twins walked in like they owned the sunlight behind them. Eleanor blinked, surprised, unsure if she was looking at the right man. Because surely a blind date wouldn't involve children, especially ones with chocolate on their chins and voices that rang out like tiny bells as they pointed to a table and shouted, "That one, Daddy, the one with the pirate book." Marcus gave her an apologetic smile, the kind that made her heart pause just long enough to notice, and said softly, "Hi, Eleanor. Sorry, I hope this isn't too weird. I didn't have anyone to watch them today, and I thought maybe it was better to be honest and still show up than cancel again." Still watching him, she nodded slowly, her brain catching up to the way he gently helped each child into their chair, patting their heads with a tenderness she'd never seen in the men she dated. And although the situation screamed red flag to every dating rule she'd ever written in her head, something about him, not desperate, not boastful, just calm, kept her seated. "This is Ava, and this little storm cloud is Max," Marcus introduced, and the twins beamed, Max offering her a sticky hand that she took with a reluctant but genuine grin. "Hi, Miss Lady," Ava chirped, and Eleanor chuckled, her nerves dissolving like sugar in warm water. The waitress came by, clearly familiar with the trio, and asked the usual, "Marcus?" To which he nodded, though he glanced nervously at Eleanor like he wasn't sure if the usual would embarrass him today. The meal was simple pancakes for the twins, coffee for Marcus, tea for Eleanor, and a shared scone that Max tried to hide in his hoodie pocket, declaring it a midnight snack. As they talked, Eleanor learned Marcus was a single dad, a full-time freelancer, someone who'd once been in finance but left the corporate world after his wife passed away from cancer 3 years ago. The same year, he became both mother and father to the twins, who clearly adored him beyond words. She asked the usual questions cautiously, bracing for the holes in the story that most men left. But the more he spoke, the more she noticed the details. How he wiped the kids' mouths instinctively, how he didn't interrupt them when they spoke, how he made eye contact with Eleanor without scanning her body like others had, and how he laughed softly, not boastfully, when Ava tried to recite her alphabet rap and forgot every letter after D. And then came the moment that surprised even her, the moment she realized she wasn't checking her phone or thinking about how to leave, but was, instead, asking him how he managed dinner with 2 picky kids and how he stayed calm when Max dropped his juice and cried. Because, rather than get frustrated, Marcus simply took a napkin, knelt beside his son, and whispered something that made the boy laugh through his tears. She realized then that he wasn't just a single dad, he was a father who showed up. And in a world of men who disappeared behind excuses, that alone made her heartbeat do strange things. The cafe began to thin out, the morning rush turning into a lull of murmurs and jazz. And as Eleanor gathered her coat, expecting them to leave together toward the bus stop out front, she offered to pay, gesturing at Marcus, who looked down sheepishly and said, "I promise I'll get the next one. Just tight week." She nodded, feeling oddly good about covering the bill, not out of pity, but because it wasn't the first time she'd seen someone trying hard for someone else. They stepped outside. The air smelled of rain waiting to fall, the sky gray and heavy like her thoughts, and she crouched to hug Ava and Max goodbye, brushing a curl from Ava's cheek and promising, "You guys were my favorite brunch buddies." Just as she turned back to Marcus, ready to say goodbye and walk toward her parked car, something caught her eye, something surreal. From across the street, a sleek black limo with tinted windows glided toward the curb like a shadow, coming to a smooth stop beside them. A uniformed driver stepped out quickly, nodded at Marcus, and opened the door with silent precision. Eleanor froze, unsure if it was some mistake or part of a prank, until Max clapped and shouted, "Yay!" Mr. James brought the big car and darted inside, followed by Ava, who spun once dramatically like a princess entering her castle. Marcus turned to her, suddenly a little sheepish again, running a hand over the back of his neck and saying, "So, I wasn't completely honest. I didn't lie. I just didn't say everything. I wanted today to be real. I wanted you to meet us, not the version of me that comes with press, accounts, and assumptions. Eleanor stood speechless, the wind catching the hem of her coat, her mouth parting, but nothing coming out, as he stepped back toward the limo, paused, and added with a hopeful grin, "If you're still curious, the second date has a little less syrup and a lot more honesty. You in." And with that, he slid into the vehicle, leaving Eleanor standing on the sidewalk with her thoughts unraveling like ribbons in a storm. Eleanor didn't sleep that night, not in the way that brought rest, because her mind kept replaying the scene outside the cafe like a loop she couldn't shut off. The moment the black limo rolled to a halt, the children climbing inside like it was the most natural thing in the world, and Marcos quiet, unassuming Marcus delivering that final line with a smile that somehow made her knees unsteady. Not from confusion, but from a truth so jarring it shifted her entire view of the world she thought she knew. And as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan slicing air above her, she realized how angry she wasn't, how betrayed she didn't feel, and instead, how intrigued she'd become, not because he turned out to be wealthy, but because everything else about him still felt real. Like the cafe version of Marcus wasn't a performance, but the truest version of him. And the limo just complicated the narrative in ways she wasn't sure how to process. The next morning, there was a note slipped under her apartment door in handwriting that was definitely his. Reading simply, "Friday, 5 p.m., where something comfortable. Driver will pick you up. Trust me." And although Eleanor stared at it for a full 10 minutes, her heart already knew she was going. When Friday came, she stood outside her building, a simple lavender blouse, tucked into jeans, and her hair pinned back with a kind of anxious elegance that betrayed her heartbeat. And true to the promise, the same limo arrived. The same driver, Mr. James, stepping out with a nod, his face unreadable, but his manners impeccable, opening the door with an almost ceremonial gesture that made Eleanor feel like a character in a novel she hadn't read the ending to. Inside, the car smelled like fresh linen and something soft jasmine. And she found herself sitting across from Marcus, not in a suit, not in designer wear, but in a plain black hoodie, jeans, and sneakers that looked like they'd actually walked places, his eyes meeting hers like they'd never broken contact since the last time. "You came," he said, and she shrugged with a half smile. "I was curious and confused." He didn't laugh. Instead, he nodded, understanding that honesty was now the currency between them. And for the next 30 minutes, they talked not about money, not about status, but about the ordinary things that suddenly felt safe again. The way Ava hated green peas, and how Max insisted his stuffed monkey had to sit at the dinner table or he wouldn't eat. How Marcus loved late-night baking as a way to remember his late wife, who once dreamed of opening a bakery named Sugarbird, and how, after her death, Marcus sold his stake in his financial firm and disappeared from the world that only saw him as an asset, not a man grieving, not a father raising twins alone. The limo pulled into an unexpected place of field just outside the city, flat and wide, where a large white tent stood, surrounded by fairy lights and wooden crates that served as makeshift tables. And Eleanor stepped out slowly, realizing the tent wasn't for an event, but a quiet dinner Marcus had arranged just for them. With a table for two, a basket of sandwiches, and 2 mason jars filled with lemonade, sitting under the soft, golden glow of hanging bulbs. I didn't want our second date to be another restaurant or something cold, he said as he offered her a seat on a cushioned crate. I wanted this to feel like a memory, not a checklist. Eleanor was stunned not by the extravagance, but by the intimacy of it all. By the way, he noticed small things like her favorite color. The napkins were lilac. Her love for wildflowers, they were scattered across the table. And even her obsession with grilled cheese and tomato soup, which was hidden in a flask inside the basket, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a woman being tested, but a woman seen. They talked for hours long past sunset, like how her father abandoned them when she was 9, and how that wound made her push away any man who looked like he might leave too. How she'd been engaged once, but called it off the night she caught her fiancé reading texts from someone else. How she'd built walls so high, even she forgot how to climb them anymore. Marcus listened not with solutions, but with silence that held space for her pain, and when she paused, expecting judgment, he simply said, "I think you're brave," and that broke her in the most unexpected, tender way. After dinner, he didn't kiss her, not yet, but walked her to the limo, held her door like a gentleman from a forgotten era, and as they rode back to the city, his hand brushed hers gently, not possessively, and the quiet between them felt warm, not awkward. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor saw Marcus, often, not always, or grand gestures, but sometimes at playgrounds where he pushed the twins on swings while she laughed from a nearby bench. Sometimes in bookstores where they argued about fiction versus non-fiction, while Max chewed gummy worms behind a comic book. And sometimes over late-night phone calls that turned into whispered confessions about loneliness, guilt, and hope. She met the twins officially during a picnic, where Ava painted her nails badly and Max asked if she could stay forever. And when Marcus watched that exchange, his eyes went soft in a way that made Eleanor's heart do the same. Still, she couldn't shake the looming question, what exactly did Marcus do now? Because while he never flaunted wealth, it was obvious he had it. The housekeeper she met one afternoon, when she visited his modest but stunning townhouse in Westwood, the custom-built treehouse in a backyard that had a mini-fridge, and the art on the walls that looked original even to her untrained eye. When she asked him directly, he told her calmly, "I own equity in several firms' investments from before. I don't run them, but I still receive returns. I live simply now, for my peace, for my kids." And somehow, the explanation felt both too much and not enough. But she didn't press, because what mattered more was how he showed up every time without fail. Yet, not everyone in her life saw it that way. Monica, the friend who'd set them up, was shocked when she found out the truth. "You're dating a secret millionaire." "Eleanor, what if it's a trap? What if he's hiding more?" Her mother, always cautious, asked pointedly, "Does he need you? Or are you just the charity project of a bored rich man?" And although Eleanor hated the doubt they planted in her, she couldn't help but wonder why her. With all his wealth, all his access, why choose a woman who lived in a one-bedroom flat, who worked long hours managing a library, who had trust issues and battle scars she hadn't even begun to treat? That question lingered quietly until one night, Marcus invited her to a fundraiser gallant as a guest, but as his date hand, she hesitated for hours before texting yes. The night of the event, a dress arrived at her door, elegant but simple, deep emerald green, the exact color he once said made her eyes look like forests in the rain. And when she arrived at the venue, an old museum turned ballroom, she nearly turned back, overwhelmed by the elegance, the flashing cameras, the whispers of society's elite. But when she stepped inside, Marcus was waiting in a sharp black tux that made him look like every movie star rolled into one. And yet his first words weren't about her appearance, but simply, "You came. I'm so glad." That night, he introduced her not as someone he was seeing, but as Eleanor, with pride in his voice and softness in his touch. And when someone asked what she did, Marcus answered for her. "She manages an entire community's knowledge. She's a protector of stories. That's far more important than what I do." And in that moment, Eleanor understood he didn't love her in spite of who she was, but because of it. He saw her, truly, in a world where most men barely looked past her skin. And just as the night ended, as the orchestra played its last note, and Marcus pulled her into a slow dance under the dim lights, he leaned close, his lips brushing her ear, and whispered, "I didn't fall for the girl who was impressed by a limo. I fell for the woman who treated my children like they were magic before she even knew who I was." Eleanor didn't reply with words, only closed her eyes and rested her head against his chest, letting the truth of his heart sink into hers like warmth after a storm she didn't know she'd been walking through her whole life. Eleanor didn't realize how much she'd changed until she caught herself humming while brushing her teeth one ordinary Thursday. Her mind drifting not to stress or deadlines, but to Max's ridiculous joke about monkeys in pajamas and the way Ava had insisted she braid her hair like Miss Ellie for school, and when she looked at her own reflection in the mirror, she didn't see the woman who had spent years dodging love like it was a bullet. She saw someone softer, someone fuller, someone quietly daring to believe in something again. And that terrified her in the best way, because for the first time in years, her life wasn't dictated by fear, but by something brighter, something tender and terrifying and honest. Marcus had become her rhythm, never demanding, simply there whether it was sending her favorite pastries on days she had meetings, or sitting beside her on park benches while the twins collected rocks like treasures. And over time, Eleanor began letting herself exist fully in the spaces she used to retreat from. Started smiling when she walked into the library. A key. Started saying yes to things she would have once overthought until they disappeared. But the world didn't stop turning just because she was healing. And one rainy afternoon, everything shifted when Marcus was called out of town unexpectedly for a business crisis involving a startup he once helped fund something to do with a breach, an ethics committee, lawyers, and although he tried to downplay it with his usual calm, Eleanor sensed the weight in his voice, the edge of exhaustion, and so she offered without hesitation to watch the twins for the weekend. It was a simple offer on the surface, but as she packed a bag and moved into his house for 3 days, something profound stirred inside her. Wasn't just about babysitting. It was stepping into his world completely, into the routines and rhythms of a life she'd only seen from the outside. And by the end of the first night, with Max curled up against her arm and Ava snoring softly beside her, Eleanor found herself crying quietly into the darkness, not out of fear or sadness, but because it all felt so right and she didn't know what to do with something so whole. The weekend passed with finger painting, popcorn movies, burnt toast, and Max declaring she made better sandwiches than Daddy, which made her laugh and also ache. And by the time Marcus returned, hair damp from the rain and tie loosened, he stood in the doorway watching them, his eyes unreadable until she walked over and he simply said, "You're amazing. Do you know that?" and kissed her so gently it made her knees forget how to stand. That night, after the kids were asleep, they sat on the back porch under the string light, wrapped in a blanket, his fingers tangled in hers, and Marcus finally opened up, not just about money or business, but about grief, about how he sometimes still heard his late wife's voice in the kitchen when the kettle whistled, how he once doubted if he'd ever be enough for his kids without her, how every smile he gave was stitched over loss. And Eleanor listened not as a spectator, but as someone who had also stood alone in a storm and now, finally, found shelter. And that's when he asked, not with fanfare, not with flash, but with trembling sincerity, "Would you move in with us? Not now, not tomorrow, just when you're ready, when it feels like home to you too." The words made her chest tight, not from panic, but from the realization that this was the man she'd been waiting for, not perfect, not polished, but present. And she whispered yes into his shoulder, holding him like she never wanted to let go. Weeks turned into months, and the transition was imperfect, cried the first night Eleanor moved in officially, unsure if it meant her mom was being replaced, and Max had a meltdown when Eleanor accidentally threw away a magic rock he found at recess, but they worked through it, slowly, with late-night talks, quiet reassurances, and an honesty that built bridges instead of walls, and eventually, Eleanor found herself part of a rhythm she never imagined she'd have: grocery runs where Max clung to her leg like a koala, bedtime stories that always turned into 3 stories, then 4, then just one more, and Sunday mornings when Marcus danced with her in the kitchen in his socks, while the kids howled with laughter. Still, the outside world wasn't always kind. Rumors began to swirl, colleagues of Marcus whispering about the librarian girlfriend, some tabloids digging into her past when they were spotted together at a charity auction, strangers on the internet calling her a gold digger or worse. And although Marcus shielded her as much as he could, the noise crept in sometimes, made her question if love was enough to silence a world obsessed with labels and status. But every time doubt surfaced, Marcus grounded her once by placing her hand over his heart and saying, "This is the only place I've ever needed you to belong." And another time, after a brutal online article, when he brought home a stack of printouts notes Sava and Max had written about her, drawings of their family with her in the center, and said, "Their opinion matters more than all of those strangers combined." And he was right, because love wasn't about proving herself to people who didn't know. Hurt was about being there when Ava lost her first tooth and insisted on writing a letter to the Tooth Fairy and Eleanor about helping Max through a nightmare by letting him fall asleep between them, about watching Marcus fall asleep on the couch with a business report still open on his chest, and knowing, without a doubt, that this was home. Time passed, and one winter morning, as snow dusted the garden and the twins made snow angels, Marcus called her outside, a twinkle in his eye, and handed her a small, hand-painted box that Ava had decorated with glitter and Max had sealed with a sticker that said, "Top Secret." Inside was a ring knot, flashy, not massive, but simple and stunning. A sapphire surrounded by delicate gold leaf sand. Marcus, already on one knee, said, "We're not just asking you to marry me. We're asking you to be ours officially, forever, if you'll have us." And Eleanor, eyes full of tears and heart bursting so hard it felt like her ribs might crack from the pressure of joy, said yes, not just to the man, but to the life, the chaos, the children, the grief, the joy, the everything. The wedding was small, just family, close friends, and a few neighbors, but it was filled with laughter, dancing, and a moment during the vows when Max shouted, "Don't forget to promise not to throw away my rocks again," which made everyone laugh, and Eleanor cried so hard she couldn't finish her vows without Marcus whispering, "Breathe, my love," while wiping her cheeks. And later that night, when the guests had gone and the kids were asleep in the cottage they'd rented for the weekend, Marcus pulled her into his arms and whispered, "You turned our house into a home." And she replied, "You turned my fear into a future." And they stood in that silence, letting the past fall away like petals on the floor. Years passed. Not every day was perfect. There were still arguments about chores and worries, about school and difficult conversations about how to talk to the kids about their biological mother. But they built a life like a quilt, piece by piece, full of color and contrast and comfort. And one day, while walking through the park, holding Marcus's hand and watching the twins run ahead, Eleanor caught her reflection in a shop window and saw a woman fully alive, fully rooted and fully known, not because of wealth or status or limo, but because one man with 2 kids chose to show up as himself and invited her to do the same. And as Marcus turned to her, eyes full of quiet wonder, and asked, "You still think I was just a broke, single dad?" she laughed, leaned into him, and said, "You'll always be that guy to me, but that's exactly why I fell in love." And in that moment, surrounded by snowflakes, giggles, and the echo of a journey that began with pancakes and pocket change, Eleanor knew she hadn't just found a love story, she had built one.